President Trump had the special forces operation. It took place over the course of about 2.5 hours. He got in, he got Maduro, and he got out. So far, at least, it seems as if President Trump knows how to measure the amount of force he wants to use to get the objective that he has in mind, and then he doesn't have any more grandiose ambitions beyond that. It really is ingenious to be able to get, millions, maybe even billions of dollars from taxpayers by starting completely fraudulent entities. The very sinister quality of so many, in the American statist left who say that, they know that things like this are happening, and they do not want you to investigate it. They will discourage it. They will call you a racist.
"2026 has got to be your year. If you've ever thought about starting a new business or setting up a new side hustle, now is the time to do it. Maybe you've got an idea in your head that you just can't shake, or a special skill your friends all admire, or a shop you've already designed in your mind. Well, with the help of Shopify, it has never been easier to turn your ideas into reality. Shopify gives you everything you need to sell online and in person. You'll be joining the millions of entrepreneurs who've already made this leap, from first-time business owners who are just getting started to massive brands like Tesla and Gymshark. Shopify gives you all the tools you need to easily build your dream shop. There are hundreds of beautiful templates for you to choose from, which you can easily customize to match your brand. The setup is really fast thanks to Shopify's groundbreaking AI tools. They will help you write product descriptions and headlines and help you edit photos so that everything looks as appealing as possible. Marketing is built in too. You can create email and social media campaigns that will reach potential customers wherever they scroll. And as your business grows, Shopify grows with you. You'll be able to handle more orders, expand to new markets, and do it all from the same dashboard. In 2026, stop waiting and start selling with Shopify. Sign up for your £1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/Brendan. That's shopify.co.uk/Brendan. Go to shopify.co.uk/Brendan and hear your first this year. Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Daniel McCarthy. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brendan. It's a delight to join you.
Great to have you back on. I was thinking, who should I talk to about Venezuela? And of course, you came to mind. You wrote a great piece for us at Spike. And there's a lot to talk about in a relatively short period of time. So let's jump straight into it. I guess the first question is, were you surprised by what happened? I think most people around the world were quite shocked, quite startled by these events. I was, but then I'm not a close follower of America-Venezuela relations, and other people were too. What was your feeling? Were you shocked, or has this been a long time coming, do you think?
I was actually pleasantly surprised. So I was afraid that with all the military assets that we were putting off the coast of Venezuela, that the United States was setting itself up for a long-term campaign. We'd already seen the attacks on the alleged drug boats. We'd seen, the possibility that we were going to have bombing and other things going on. So this could have been a prolonged campaign, which potentially could have drawn the United States into a full-scale kind of regime change operation, or even short of that, a kind of ongoing months or years long standoff with the Maduro regime. Instead, I've been pleasantly surprised that President Trump had the special forces operation. It took place over the course of about 2.5 hours. He got in, he got Maduro, and he got out. Now, obviously, there's a big question about what's coming next, but so far, at least, it seems as if President Trump knows how to measure the amount of force he wants to use to get the objective that he has in mind, and then he doesn't have any more grandiose ambitions beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's a good jumping off point. And I guess, well, just to stick with the question of the element of surprise or the element of shock that may exist, what's the mood like in the United States? I mean, obviously, people there will be much better versed than we are in Europe about the Maduro issue, the Venezuela question, the problem of drug importation and so on. People will know more of the details, but is the country surprised by what happened? Are they taken aback? What's the support level like for what Trump has done?
Yeah, there's an interesting bifurcation here in the United States. On the one hand, just about everyone who has their head screwed on straight is very impressed by the logistical and technical success of this operation. So, it's an absolutely bravura move. And even people who generally are very critical of Donald Trump say this is just a remarkable thing to pull off, logistically and militarily. On the other hand, there is lingering concern on the part of the American people about what the long term objectives here are and where we're going from here. So I think the American people are duly cautious. They're willing to give President Trump a chance. They are very impressed by what he's pulled off over this past weekend. But they want to make sure that this does not become a forever war, something that we are sunk into some long term attempt to democratize and liberalize Venezuela, that rather we have limited objectives and we have the force and the competence to pull off those objectives and then not try to do more than we can.
Yeah, I think the concern about forever wars is a good one. I'm worried about forever wars as well. I know you have been over the years as well, but this does look like something different at the moment. It remains to be seen how it pans out in the long term. But I did want to ask you about the left's response, because you make this interesting point in your piece that there's a tendency amongst kind of neocons and right wingers to see everything as a replay of 1939, and then there's this tendency amongst modern leftists to see everything as a replay of the Iraq War. Everything is the Iraq War Part 2. And they're saying that about this, and it's obviously just doesn't work as a comparison. What have you made of their use of that comparison yet again, and what would you say are the differences between these things?
It was just one of the funniest things I've ever seen, where you had a number of toothless protesters, both literally and figuratively, in Dublin of all places, hitting the streets to say, end the war with Venezuela. And of course, there is no war with Venezuela. This was a 2.5 hour operation. If you call that a war, you also have to call, the operation which nabbed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. You have to say that was a war. You have to say that Jimmy Carter had a war against Iran in 1979 when he sent in a helicopter to try to rescue American hostages. And of course, that didn't work out. It's just crazy to kind of, blow these things up and try to exaggerate them into something much larger than they actually are. So it seems to me, obviously there is an ideological reflex here, and it doesn't matter whether it's a small successful operation or whether it really is, something that is more like Iraq and that's an ongoing, disaster. The left's reaction is going to be the same either way because they are in this ideologically. They're thinking about this in terms of demonology, in terms of a kind of morality or a religion almost. They're not thinking about it in terms of just realistically what happens and what the actual practical limits are that someone like President Trump might apply to a campaign like this. So as long as Trump, I think, keeps to a fairly realistic and limited set of goals here, he can be quite successful. If he's going to start giving in to the voices, including those within his administration, who really do have a more romantic picture about what can happen in Venezuela in the near future, then we'd be in some trouble. But I was very gratified to see that President Trump said that, Maria Machado, for example, doesn't have the degree of support she would need in Venezuela to be installed as a leader there. So Trump seems to be willing to let the Venezuelans kind of sort this out for themselves now that Maduro has been taken.
So let's talk a little bit about how this is different to some of the wars that we saw over the past 25 years or so, Iraq being one of them, but also other forms of intervention in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan, of course. All of them had different justifications. Most of them had similar outcomes, which were they lasted a long time, they caused a lot of bloodshed, they dragged American troops into wars that seemed to go on forever. How would you describe the difference in motivation between what Trump is doing? You use the word realistic there. So do you think this is there's an element of foreign policy realism motoring Trump, whereas with Clinton, Obama, Bush era wars, there was something more ideological, more idealistic?
That's exactly right. For all that there were different individual grounds for things like the intervention in Afghanistan, the Afghan war, the Iraq war, the intervention in Libya, even though the initial case for getting involved in those conflicts was different each time, they were all conflicts that were undertaken with a sort of backdrop of idealism, this backdrop of once we remove a dictator, we're going to suddenly have a dictator or a force like the Taliban, which, is many dictators, in fact. Once you remove these bad actors, then you will automatically have a blooming of liberalism and democracy. And that's ultimately what we not only want to see, but what we expect to see, and will try to do everything in our power to make happen in all of these very unfortunate countries. And of course, what actually happened was that chaos took place in all of those fields of conflict, in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. The one thing that's worse than having a dictator and having a very, totalistic kind of political system is having actual, sort of chaos and civil war, sectarian bloodshed, which happened in all of those places. And of course, in Afghanistan, ultimately you had the Taliban come back to power as soon as American forces pulled out. So this whole idea of, idealistic notion of going in, nation building, trying to democratize and liberalize, it has always failed. And it's something, and people point to World War II, but World War II is not a good example because, of course, not only did you have overwhelming, destruction of Germany and Japan that created preconditions for what the West then tried to do afterwards, but even more importantly, and the thing I always, like to highlight, is the fact that both the Germans and the Japanese realized they had a choice. They could have chosen to, go along with the United States, or otherwise they would have been victims of the Soviet Union and the communists. And given that choice, they were perfectly capable of making that decision for themselves, not simply because the United States was hectoring them or telling them to liberalize and democratize, but rather because they really didn't want the alternative, which was to be subjected to communism. And the Japanese certainly could see what the communists were doing just across the sea in China at that point. So you've had these wars, which, for whatever their motivation may have been going in, ultimately become wars that are being waged and occupations that are being continued in many cases for decades in the name of idealism, in the name of high moral values, in the name of almost a utopian end state that we're trying to bring about. And all of them wound up, creating an enormous amount of death in those countries in the short run. And then in the long run, you haven't really seen the flourishing of the kinds of things that the West claims that it stands for. Trump seems to have the opposite view of all of this. Rather than going immediately into an idealistic register and trying to imagine that Venezuela will become a sort of Latin American Switzerland or something, he's instead saying, you know what? You still have the socialist regime, you still have Maduro's cronies who are in power there. And, he's given them a sharp lesson. He's indicated to them that if they continue some of their abuses, you may very well have more U.S. reactions to them. But they've now got a chance to reform and to try to sort out their own house. You do actually have some instances in Latin America over the course of decades where you've had dictatorships or socialist governments that have been willing to have free elections and get voted out of office. That happened with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in 1990. It happened with Augusto Pinochet having a referendum in Chile on the Constitution, which he lost, and he then surrendered power. So hopefully, the regime that exists in Venezuela now will get the message and will try to, sort of gradually provide more freedom for its people. But you're not having this U.S. sort of dream that we're simply going to install someone that we label as a liberal Democrat, and that's automatically going to bring about, a kind of Western style system of freedom and democracy. Instead, I think Trump has much more realistic expectations, and they're expectations that maybe you're better off trying to reform a bad regime than you are trying to unleash chaos by having total regime change.
Yeah, that was another interesting point you made in your piece, that this is not regime change in the traditional sense, given that it's basically decapitated a regime and taken off the head of government rather than changing the entire regime itself. Although, of course, it's hard to know what will come next. I guess we'll have to wait and see. In relation to the justification from Trump himself, I want to talk about the kind of conflictual messages from the MAGA movement. But if we just look at Trump himself and his close advisors, and their claim that this is just a short, sharp, in and out, 2.5 hours, as you say, get this man, put him on trial for crimes that he has committed. What's your understanding of the allegations against Maduro? What are they talking about here? I mean, we know they're talking about drugs. Are they also raising the question of uncontrolled immigration? I mean, I guess, is the justification from Trump himself that this is not so much a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty as a protection of America's sovereignty from someone who posed a threat to it? How are they putting that?
That is how Trump sees it, and I do think that this operation is part of how Trump sees hemispheric security in general for the United States and what the relationship between the United States and its nearest neighbors is supposed to be. So the Trump administration, I mean, Trump has now, invoked what he calls the Don Row doctrine. You've had the national security strategy, which has talked about refocusing on the Americas and having less engagement with far-flung conflicts, in different regions of the world. So it does seem like Trump is trying to create a South America as well as a North America where you're going to have more regimes that are friendly disposed or willing to cooperate with the United States. Not necessarily that they're going to be perfect liberal democracies of the sort that idealists during the George W. Bush years or the Barack Obama years would have liked, but rather you're going to have regimes that are not going to cause trouble for the United States and that are generally going to be willing to do business with the United States, including, of course, where oil is concerned, which Donald Trump is quite frank about talking about. That all of these things are what the Trump administration is trying to do. Even though it has talked about, drugs being on these boats and fentanyl getting into the country, that, of course, is an argument that's very hard to sustain because these boats are usually not capable of reaching the United States. So the argument then has to be made that, well, they're just, a staging ground. This goes to the Caribbean and then goes from the Caribbean to the United States. Venezuela is generally not a major source of fentanyl, a source of some cocaine, but definitely not fentanyl being the main thing. Trump is, if you make the case that he's making an example here and trying to, send a signal to the entire region, that makes sense. Whereas if you're trying to say that there's a particular, issue with fentanyl or some of these other things that the administration's brought up, that I think is much harder to sustain. Now, Trump's going to have an interesting experience here with putting Maduro in the American court system because they're not really, it seems, charging him with some of the drug issues that had been anticipated early on. Their first set of charges involved, Maduro having machine guns. You would expect a head of state to have machine guns. So, I mean, we'll see how this is going to hold up in the courts. It's going to be a really interesting experience to see how the American justice system deals with this idea of trying a foreign leader on these issues, which, again, it's not that Trump himself necessarily has created all of these things, because you had the Joe Biden administration, which already had offered something like a 50 million bounty for the capture of Maduro and for bringing him to New York. But I don't think either administration, Biden or Trump, is entirely prepared or has been entirely prepared for what's going to happen now that Maduro actually is in the American court system. And that's going to be another kind of confrontation with, you can have a foreign policy strategy that is realistic, and you can have political realism about why you're engaged in this operation. But how that's going to fit in with the formalities of the law is going to be a very hard question. And it may very well be that Maduro, I don't expect him to get off scot-free, but he might be able to beat the rap on some of the charges that the Trump administration is going to bring against him.
I mean, yeah, I was thinking that myself. It would be extraordinary if Maduro was found innocent for by whatever means, and then you think, well, what happens now? In relation to, you talked about other elements within the Trump administration who seem to be moving towards a more idealistic vision for what comes next for Venezuela. You see a similar dynamic within certain sections of the MAGA media movement, I guess, online in particular, in social media. There's a mix of things going on. There is firstly people saying, listen, this is Trumpism. This is not a return to regime change of old. This is not the forever wars. This is a very short operation to get a bad guy into the court system. But then you have other people saying, look, don't mess with America or we'll do the same to you. You have the kind of some people are talking about democratizing Venezuela, bringing democracy to Venezuela to make it a more secure nation that's going to be nearby to the United States. So there are mixed messages coming, I guess, from the broader movement or the broader camp. And I would say a little bit of arrogance as well. I mean, part of the kind of social media discussion amongst MAGA supporters has reminded me a little bit of the laptop bombardiers of the 1990s and the 2000s. That kind of almost narcissistic swagger. We'll do what we want, we'll go where we want, and we'll correct all these regimes if we want to. Now, that's not coming from Trump himself, but what are the dangers, do you think, of some of that messaging rising to the top? And the danger, I guess, of this spinning out of control and becoming more than a discrete operation to take Maduro to a court in New York?
Well, it's true. One of the problems with success is that it then encourages hubris. It encourages you to keep trying to do more. I can see there's a genuine, dilemma here because, there are people that I think are, they're sensible. They have their, not only their practical set of ideas, more or less, in at least a reasonable place, but also who have, a genuine moral concern. They want to see, a greater degree of freedom for the Venezuelan people. I mean, this Maduro regime, even without Maduro, is still a very nasty piece of socialist work. And, there are all kinds of accounts of, crackdowns on protesters, crackdowns on free speech, crackdowns on private property. I mean, this really is, a very nasty regime, and it's still in power even without Maduro being the one in the presidential palace. So I understand totally where people are coming from when they say, "Hey, this can't be the end of it. You have to have something more here. There has to be freedom. There has to be something like democracy in Venezuela." On the other hand, though, we've seen that when the United States tries to force that to happen, we've seen that when the United States tries to use, bombs and occupation and sending in troops to forcibly democratize another country, it doesn't work out well at all. And we have so many examples of this. And not only, from the 2000s, but even if you go back, during the latter part of the Cold War, we tried this again and again in Latin America. We would constantly support, anti-communist forces in El Salvador and elsewhere, and oftentimes the result of that was that you just got, more violence and instability in these countries. And yes, sometimes the communists were gotten rid of, but then you had, things like MS-13, this Salvadorian gang that's now in the United States. It actually has its origins in some of the, anti-communist forces that we supported in the 1980s. So if you go into these, sort of larger efforts, you wind up with, a situation that the United States is not going to be able to control. You can control something, with special forces going in very briefly and taking out someone like Maduro. That was, a degree of precision that I think still astonishes a lot of us, including myself, when it comes to the ability to execute something like that. But if you have these more, extended goals, that's going to be a situation you just can't control because it involves politics, economics, people's personalities, things that are, much larger questions than simply the logistics of a single operation. So, and I think Trump, on the one hand, he's signaling that he has learned the lessons of the Iraq War and of U.S. foreign policy over the last 2 decades, and that he does continually have these much smaller kinds of interventions. You saw it with the Iran intervention earlier last year. You saw it in the first term with the taking out of Soleimani in Iran. Trump would do these things, he would use massive force, and he would not then continue beyond that.
I wanted to ask you about the sovereignty issue because this is something that lots of people are talking about, and the question of whether this represents a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and whether that, I mean, I guess it does, but whether that's a justifiable violation. There's a lot of discussion around this. There's a lot of hypocrisy on this. I mean, when I see leaders of the European Union wringing their hands over, the sanctity of sovereignty and how Trump is demolishing it, you just want to kind of grab them by the scruff of the neck because the European Union is infamous for diluting sovereignty, for attacking sovereignty, for undermining the sovereignty of its member states. The left as well. The left is suddenly very interested in the issue of sovereignty, having dismissed it as a kind of right-wing plot and we should open the borders, etc., etc. So there's a lot of hypocrisy swirling around, but there have been some criticisms of the America First movement for devaluing, through this operation, devaluing the thing that they said they were interested in, which was national sovereignty, the integrity of nations, a move away from the globalist era, both in terms of globalist institutions and forever wars and all those other problems that we faced over the past few decades. What's your take on the sovereignty question? Was this a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty? Was it a justifiable one? And if so, why would you say that?
It was an assertion of American sovereignty against Venezuelan sovereignty. So the nature of sovereignty is such that every state, believes it has it, and certainly, is something that you have internally. But states also think they have sovereign interests that go beyond their borders as well, and I think that's true of pretty much every state. It's certainly, if you look at how states behave, they always have that tendency not simply to, on principle and out of pure idealistic morality, to say, "Hey, we do what we want within our own borders, but we have perfect respect for other people beyond those borders." All states have generally been willing to, project their sovereignty beyond their own, borders and try to, get what they want from other people all around the world. So, in that sense, this does, kind of tell you what the limits of sovereignty are. That, it's one thing to talk about sovereignty, but if you expect sovereignty to be something that's enforced simply by the good morality or the friendliness of, other states, that's not going to work. The way you defend your sovereignty is by having enough power to be able to, stop other people from coming in and doing things you don't want them to do in your own country. And obviously, if you're the Venezuelans, you're in a position where you have to say to yourself, well, hey, we don't have a very effective operational sovereignty here because we can't stop a foreign government from coming in and taking our president captive. Of course, Western countries, similarly enough, but in a, a slightly different way, you also have the question of sovereignty. Hey, are we sovereign enough that we can keep, Islamists from coming into our countries and, either taking down, the Twin Towers in New York or, beheading, people in England or doing other things on continental Europe? That too is the same kind of question of sovereignty. And again, it's a matter not only of asserting it morally, but actually having the laws and the police powers that allow and the defense capabilities that allow you to make sovereignty a real thing. So it's if you take the MAGA movement, nationalism, and all the things it talks about simply as being a kind of different intellectual construct fighting against this rival intellectual construct of globalism, then you could say, well, there's a hypocrisy here. This doesn't really, this is not consistent. But it's not that. It actually is a return to, uh, you know, reality, realpolitik in the sense that, governments have to have force and they use force. And then the question is, are they capable of actually achieving their ends by using force, or is force actually getting them into, over their heads with situations they can't control? And actually, by reducing the amount of morality and idealism that's involved in foreign policy, you're able to, keep things to much more strict limits. Whereas when you start expanding that, when you have situations like, the wars of religion in 17th century Europe, that's when you have conflicts that just burn out of control. And to a very surprising degree, not surprising to some of us, but surprising to a lot of, normie folks out there, the liberal democratic wars of the early 21st century, they too were religious wars in the sense that, you had this attempt to bring a Western idea of morality and proper social structure, human rights and democracy and everything else, to parts of the world where that was unfamiliar and where it wasn't clear that you had, a population that actually wanted to accept that or that had the social institutions necessary to implement that. So you wound up just as you did in 17th century Europe with wars that would go on for decades. And thankfully, they were not quite as bloody as those 17th century wars, but they certainly had no intrinsically limiting principle. And of course, if our liberal democratic, sort of holy warriors got their way, we would still be in Afghanistan today. And that wouldn't just be a 20-year war. That would be an 80-year war, a 100-year war, be a forever war, in reality.
I mean, they really did feel like religious wars. I remember thinking similarly at the time, that the zeal with which some of those wars were pursued was quite extraordinary. Um, I wanted to ask you about the multipolar question and what's happening, whether we are witnessing the birth of a new global settlement, I guess, because you said earlier on that there does seem to be an effort on the part of the Trump administration to bring America out of those far-flung places that it has been intervening in for a long time. And one thinks of the Middle East and other parts of the world, but maybe to open up its old backyard, as Latin America sometimes was referred to as America's backyard, to make that more of a sphere of influence for America. And then, of course, we have the rise of Russia, which is influential through Iran and various other parts of the Russian sphere in the Middle East, and then China. The ceaseless rise of China. Do you see a kind of division of the world, whether it happens, I guess, peaceably or not, between those three powers? And is that something you think Trump is conscious of? Not only that he wants to end these forever wars, but he wants to control his own sphere of influence against these other rising spheres of influence.
Yeah, a division might be putting it a little too sharply. And of course, there are other powers that are significant players in each of
Yeah.
these regions. In the case of China, not only does it have to, deal with powers like Japan, which are not trivial actually, but also, of course, you've got this other, rising giant in the form of India. So you've got a very complicated situation there, and it won't simply be a matter of China having a sphere of influence and being able to dictate policy to all of its neighbors. You really do have a balance there. In Europe, the big question is whether Europeans themselves want to have, a um, a balance of powers basically between themselves and Russia. And what we've had, over the course of several decades now has been Europeans kind of trying to have it both ways, where they want to continue to expand their reach, including, into, what had formerly been Soviet republics, places like Ukraine, while at the same time not expecting that the Russians are ever going to be worried about this and are ever going to respond forcefully as a result. And, you know, wise statesmen have been saying since the end of the 1990s that if you keep doing this, the Russians really are going to react with force. The Russians, they perceive this as aggression. They see the expansion of NATO. They see the expansion of the European Union. They see all of this as basically being, an attempt to, drive a deeper and deeper salient. First of all, into the proximity of Russia, into its neighborhood, but ultimately, of course, they foresee a partitioning of Russia or attempts to bring about division within Russia itself, and that's something the Russians have a very strong allergic reaction to and always have. I mean, it's something that Russia itself has experienced a lot of defeats at the hands of other European powers and at the hands of at the Japanese and others. So Russia doesn't see itself as this invincible bully constantly putting pressure on its neighbors. There are good reasons why its neighbors feel that way, but Russia itself actually thinks of itself as being very exquisitely vulnerable and doesn't take these expansions of Western influence and power as being unthreatening. So there has to be a much more realistic understanding between the Europeans and the Russians of the feelings on both sides, and then that understanding has to be backed up by an awareness of the strength on the part of the Europeans, a willingness on the part of the Europeans to say no to the Russians and to deploy force if need be in order to prevent Russia from doing something like invading Poland or otherwise being extremely aggressive. But it also has to be, the Europeans being less idealistic and being willing to say, you know what, Finlandization actually worked fairly well for Finland and for Austria during the Cold War. Maybe Ukraine has to be a bit of a neutral territory between Russia and the European Union. The Europeans have to be willing to accept this, and that hasn't been the case so far. In general, it's been Europeans going to the Americans and saying, "Hey, we need more support. You have to put in more money for Ukraine. You have to have basically this deep ongoing conflict. Even if Ukrainians just wind up getting killed without being able to retake their territory, this has to keep going on and on and on, and the United States has to be responsible for it, simply because this is how we stick it to Russia." That's led to absolute, disaster and ongoing bloodshed with no resolution in sight. So this regionalization of conflict and this recognition that weak states really are weak, that puts them in a, they're not going to be able to claim equality with strong states. This is not, something that we, morally want to celebrate, but it's something that we have to accept. And if we try to deny the truth of international relations in the name of a higher morality, that just gets us into these forever wars, into these, conflicts, which actually wind up making things much worse. You have to be, truthful about what power can and cannot do in the world.
I wanted to ask you what you think might come next. I mean, there's lots of discussion about where Trump might strike next. I mean, some of it's very excitable discussion on the internet, and some of it's kind of much more measured in the press and in Trump's own circles. There's talk about Cuba, finally doing something about Cuba in a meaningful way, or Mexico. And of course, there's the Greenland question, which is causing huge consternation here in Europe. Although I read a good piece today saying, okay, maybe we don't want America to invade Greenland, but why does Denmark have control over Greenland? I mean, there are all those old questions that people seem unwilling to ask. So where do you see this kind of, I guess, Trump realpolitik going next, or what do you see it doing next? Do you think it will carry on in the vein that we've just seen over the past few days, or will something different take place?
I think Trump has a fairly well established record now, both in his first term and so far in his second, of these rather small interventions, which he then declares victory in. They're short term successes, and they're quite, stunning short term successes. I mean, he brought an end to a conflict that had been going on for weeks between Iran and Israel, and he did it very swiftly. And you can complain, people can criticize the terms on which that conflict ended, but U.S. interventions really did seem to end a war rather than start one that was going to be prolonged and ongoing. Um, I think Trump, is going to continue doing things in that vein. He has to be careful to not get tempted into these more sort of long-term reconstructive efforts. And when people talk about doing to Cuba what was just done in Venezuela, it's a totally different situation. I mean, Fidel Castro is long dead. What they'd be talking about in Cuba is trying to actually change the regime. And of course, I think the distinction between decapitation and actual regime change is an important one. You can decapitate a regime successfully, as Trump did in Venezuela, but trying to actually change it to go in there, with larger force and reconstruct it, that's different. And Cuba, of course, has been a socialist country for a very long time. That regime has very deep roots in terms of its, infiltration of the social structure of the country. It would be extremely difficult, I think, to try to go in and use military force to change that situation. Now, it's been very disappointing. I had some hopes actually for Barack Obama's opening to Cuba back during his administration, where there was this hope that maybe, now that Fidel Castro was gone, you would have some degree of opening and, a sort of gradual fall within Cuba itself. And that hasn't happened. The Cuban, leaders have been quite tenacious in holding on to power. I think Trump, is generally very realistic. He accepts that there are lots of bad governments around the world. It is not the United States' holy mission to change those governments and try to, redeem the planet through military force. But there are people who still have, the older sort of George W. Bush way of thinking. Some of them are within the administration itself. Certainly, many of them are in the media, including the media on the conservative side of things. And so this is constantly, there's going to be this, sort of little George W. Bush devil sitting on Trump's shoulder, whispering in his ear, do more, have a regime change, get into Cuba. And Trump has to have the fortitude and the, sort of grounding in reality to keep telling that little, Bush imp on his shoulder, no.
Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you about an issue that has had an American issue that's had a huge amount of cut through here in Britain and in Europe. Not the Venezuela question, that has as well, obviously, but the Minnesota Somali fraud scandal. I wanted to get your views on that because, I mean, I guess this also touches on questions of American sovereignty and America's borders and the question of who comes to America, what America stands for. This has had huge cut through here. People are talking about it quite widely, not least because we face similar problems in Britain and in other European countries. Listeners will be familiar that there was this vast Somali fraud scheme, as far as we can see, where lots of money was taken from the taxpayer and used to fund these educational and charity groups that didn't actually do anything. Give us a little update on what's happening there, and I guess what you think that tells us about America at the moment and what its problems are.
Well, it's stunning, and it it confirms so many things that many conservatives and people on the right have generally suspected, but that up till now, was not confirmed or wasn't going to be reported by the mainstream media. One of the parts of the story I think is most interesting is that an independent journalist just went to these daycares that were receiving taxpayer funding and just showed that there were no children there. That in fact, that these and of course, you have a sign, this quality learning center, it was supposed to say, but learning is misspelled in the sign. So the whole thing was just an absolute utter sham. And a guy who just, went there with his cell phone and started recording, he exposed this. And, you'd had before this, you'd had whistleblowers, you'd had, there was a poor Somali guy who actually was trying to draw attention to some of these abuses that people in his own community were perpetrating. And he wound up, getting thrown out and getting harassed by other Somalis and going back to Somalia and getting harassed there. I mean, and then you think about the United States mainstream media, whenever there were indications that something like this was happening, the mainstream media would basically take the side of the fraudsters. They would say it's racist to question what's happening here. Oh, how can you go after poor people like this? It's so wonderful that they have these charitable daycare centers and other things. Hey, isn't it great that you have these immigrants who are entrepreneurial and who are starting businesses like daycares? Well, they're very entrepreneurial, and it really is ingenious to be able to get, millions, maybe even billions of dollars from taxpayers by starting completely fraudulent entities. I just think it's a wonderful illustration of the naivete of so many ordinary good Americans of goodwill, and the very sinister quality of so many, in the American statist left who say that, who they know that things like this are happening and they do not want you to investigate it. They will discourage it. They will call you a racist. It's been wonderful to see that Governor Tim Walz from Minnesota has had to, suspend his efforts at getting reelected because, this scandal is so big that he can't run away from it. And hopefully it's going to not only damage his administration, but also his party, which, has been in charge of Minnesota for quite some time. And it just, but it's not just Minnesota. I mean, as you say, this is something where Europe has this problem as well. Other American states have this problem, and it's going to take independent journalists to go and expose this stuff because the mainstream doesn't want to do it. Even the Republican Party in Minnesota, people you would think, hey, they're the conservative party, they would want to expose these things. They were discouraging to anyone who brought up these problems. You have, Republican officers like officials like Tom Emmer, who's a congressman from Minnesota, actually a congressman with some degree of leadership status within the Republican Party in Congress. He Whenever a constituent of his would bring this up in a town hall, Emmer would try to say, "Well, it sounds like you're getting kind of racist there. It sounds like you're getting into something you don't know anything about." So the Republican Party too was trying to hush this up and overlook it because the Somalis that have been brought in, they're tens if not hundreds of thousands. They are a very significant voting bloc now in Minnesota. And Europe, of course, has this issue with all of the newcomers that it's brought in as well. So if they're breaking the law, if they are, it could be anything from, female genital mutilation through to welfare scams, grooming scandals. All of this is something that winds up getting suppressed by the mainstream media and by the political parties on both sides, the main, establishment politics, because it's embarrassing to say this new constituency that we're all supposed to say is going to instantly assimilate and become westernized might in fact be doing things that are criminal and may in fact be ripping off taxpayers or inflicting hardships, including on its own people. Right? I mean, that's one of the things that really ticks me off so much here is that when the left talks about racism, that police are racist, and that talking about grooming gangs is racist. Well, of course, so many of the victims of these crimes in America's inner cities and elsewhere, it's not just white people. It's most often people within those communities themselves. It's African Americans. It's violence within immigrant communities. These things, are perfectly acceptable to white liberals as long as you have that mass migration continuing, and as long as you have the chaos in many of our cities continuing. White liberals see that as an acceptable price to pay for multiculturalism and for the mass immigration they prefer. So I think there really is a kind of avalanche effect here, where hopefully this scandal in Minnesota not only starts to change the way Americans look at what's happening, but also wakes up Europe too.
Daniel, thank you very much.